Thank you. Why don't we start this? I thought that'd be a little more fun than me trying to introduce ViaSat to you guys. And it's true I was the CFO, but I don't have a background in finance, so which says a little bit something about ViaSat. I'm an IT and math guy. So we try to do things a little bit differently at the company. I haven't been here all day, but I have looked at what you guys have been talking about all day. A pretty fascinating and fun and interesting day for everyone. A lot of great speakers and great topics like mobility and AI and IoT and 5G and GSMA and healthcare and education and things that we're at ViaSat definitely very passionate about. So I'm really excited to come up for just a minute and talk. And what I was asked to talk about, a little bit about ViaSat, but a lot about innovation and how we're using innovation to change what we're doing at ViaSat, how we pursue innovation, how we think about that in terms of our business and what we're doing in the world. And the first thing certainly that comes to mind when we think about innovation is our people. And so we're very, very focused on talent and the type of people we bring in, and hyper-focused on reducing turnover in the company. So we have invested a great deal just in terms of the environment that we put them in, but more about tools and the projects they get to work on, the kind of things they get to work on. And so if you go, I think now in most Viasat locations globally, I'll show you a little bit about that in a minute, but you're going to have a very common look and feel, a very common approach to how we approach our projects. Most recently, one of the coolest things, how many people here know what Glassdoor is? Well, Glassdoor mainly, if you know, is where people go on to complain about the employers they work with and for. It's really mostly a complaint site. So we were recognized recently as in the top 100 of those over 1 million companies on Glassdoor, just in terms of employee rating, which really only means we're one of the least complained about companies. So I'm not sure how that registers, but also one of the top places to work for. We've got just an enormous amount of things going on with our employees, a lot of it led by our employees. And so especially as we get involved in the community, we are an employee-led company in terms of our community involvement. We have, over the years, built a fairly diversified business segment group, and some investors are critical of us for that. But I remember when broadband was taking off in the late 90s and the defense wasn't doing that great, people told us to exit defense, and then 9/11 occurred and defense business was growing and people didn't really want to talk about broadband investments, and we were encouraged to divest ourselves of the other businesses. And thank God we don't always listen to what Wall Street tells us to do. So both those businesses have grown dramatically. We're about 60% commercial, 40% government related products, all focused on communications. Communications is the core background. The company was founded by 3 guys. I think we are the second most successful, if you measure it by market cap and employees and tenure, company to come out of the old Linkabit group, next to Qualcomm. And it's going to be pretty hard to catch Qualcomm in the long run. But our main focus right now is, we'll talk about that a little bit, but is very, very difficult communication problems. And in order to accomplish some of those, we've had to vertically integrate. So we go from chip design to actually satellite payload construction and almost everything in between, the radios, the RF side, antenna development. You can see some of the things that we do here. We'll talk a little bit more about these segments, but there's a guy climbing a ladder on what looks like a shack that's from a rural community in Mexico, where we have now several thousand villages connected that most of those, over 80% of those, have never been connected before. We've gone into small communities, we're able to do it economically, and we're connecting people that, and what's really interesting is when we go into these communities, all of a sudden hundreds of unique devices get registered. So most of these people have smartphones. They've been given them by their relatives, or they've picked them up when they're in a city, and they're charged and ready to go. So when you show up, we have a very ready group of people to talk to. So just real quick before we go on, just a quick little story about three guys that you all know, or at least you know a couple of them. One of them was here today, but Irwin Jacobs, who was the founder of Linkabit and then the founder of Qualcomm. Pradeep Khosla, who was here earlier, the chancellor at UCSD, and then the founder of ViaSat, Mark Dankberg, who had worked for Irwin at Linkabit. They were being interviewed recently, and one of the things they were asked is, what are you going to be most proud of, when you've passed away, and at your funeral, what do you want them to say about you? It's a very serious question, and Irwin says, well, I think my academics to start with in the engineering school at UCSD, and then Linkabit and Qualcomm and the commercial successes that we've had in taking products to the market. And then later in the years, my philanthropy and what I've done for the community here is like, wow, that's unbelievable, pretty hard to beat. They asked Pradeep, and Pradeep says, well, we took this great gem of a university and we've grown it to one of the top universities in the world. And we've been able to combine the business school and the engineering school and the medical school. And, I think that's quite a legacy for me to have left behind. And it's like, yeah, it's fantastic. And they asked Mark Dankberg, how about you, Mark? These are two icons. How would you, I know it's a little further off for you, hopefully, but what are you going to want them to say? He goes, I think I'm going to want them to say, look, he's moving. At least a couple of you got that. So in addition to the talent, what we're most focused, though, from an innovation standpoint, is our customers. And when we think about our customers, we want to think about outcomes. It's not really products, it's outcomes. And what are we trying to do? And so our primary outcome in one of the branches of this, and you're going to see that we're on a mission to try to get communication to people that's the hardest people to possibly get communication to. So we talked about the villages in Mexico, but the hardest one is to communicate with something that's going about 500 miles an hour in the air. That's a commercial airplane or a military airplane or a UAV platform or something that's traveling at great speeds, and to get broadband communication, to real broadband communication. So the outcome we're looking for is, if it feels like you're at home, then we've achieved our objective, not like some of the other, I'm sure, commercial internet that you've paid for and been very unhappy at the end. So we allow, certainly on JetBlue is our big launch airline. You can stream Netflix to your seat on JetBlue for free. And we think that's quite an accomplishment, and the most difficult group to serve. Most of the DoD VIP military fleet we serve are using our broadband connectivity. We're building 3 satellites right now that'll cover the world And we think all the airlines at some point is going to have broadband, just like your hotel rooms do, for free, or if not for free, hopefully what we'd call a freemium service, where there's certain services that are free and you may have to pay for a premium service. We believe it's going to be ubiquitous, and we believe it's going to be global, and we think that we're going to kind of win that race there. So very, very focused on that. Our goal is, if it feels like it's at home when you're in the air, that's what we want our brand to represent. We think that really is true innovation, and innovation in a very difficult market. The other one that I showed you a minute ago was community Wi-Fi. So how do we get to people in Mexico and Brazil and Central America and Indonesia and Asia and Africa, and bring things that are really, really important? So it's really not just the communication or the commercial success. How do we do that economically, and how do we do that in a way that can change people's lives? So the outcomes we're focused on there are education, number one. And to that regard, we've partnered with UCSD. We know that if we can get the average female, and it really is the female side that we have to work on, if we get the average female in an African village at 8th grade level or above, it changes everything in that village. It changes the entire social impact and economic impact of that village. And you can measure it. And so education is kind of number one for us as we reach out to these communities that don't have internet access. Number two is healthcare. So healthcare, being able to reach, and we work with many telemedicine products, and we have one that we're working with specifically where we can bring access to doctors into any community in the world. And again, with these 3 satellites, a very focused. Commerce is the next one. So we have, with one of our partners in Peru, we have a video of a 90-year-old woman walking across a rope bridge across a canyon, which she has to do every month just to collect her equivalent of her Social Security check, because she doesn't have the ability to connect in the village that she's in. We change these people's lives with bringing internet to them, and it's not just internet to them; it's internet that's affordable. We can go into these villages for less than $2,000 in a village, and begin to offer prepaid services that can have an enormous impact. Enterprise is the next one. So if most of that market's headed towards software-defined wide area networks, and we will own the entire piece of that wide area network to enterprises that can't get fiber and can't get 5G connections, where in dense urban environments, so that maybe they're just a little bit outside that environment or whatever. And in order to do that, we're having to put what we describe as a hybrid technology together, a satellite linked with a less than reliable wireless or DSL or LEO satellite network in those environments, so we can have low latency traffic routed over the low latency network, but really high speed, high volume traffic routed over our satellites. Each one of these satellites, by the way, when we launched our first satellite in 2011, the one that we had designed and built, that satellite had more than twice the capacity of all the other data satellites over the U.S. combined. It has about 140, 150 gigabits of capacity. The ones we're building right now have over a terabit of capacity, and the next generation, we believe, will be at 4 to 5x of that. And that we have that design, but we are changing this market dramatically. Before we launched that 140, a state-of-the-art data satellite might have had 6 or 7 gigabits of throughput. So pretty dramatic changes from an innovation standpoint. The problem we were trying to solve is how do we drive bandwidth costs dramatically down, because we know that people's demands are substantially higher. And we think we need 4 nines of availability. And so a lot of our network design is designed to enable 4 nines of availability, especially with a backup low latency network attached. The other market is really residential broadband, residential internet. We have 700,000 residential subscribers. We expect that over time will grow, but they're they have more options in general, but to the extent that they can't get high-speed internet. And as of yesterday, one of the telecom and media analysts was describing there's 143 what they'd describe as real or legitimate streaming providers, 143 streaming providers. The main thing people use for the traditional network television is sports. It's sports, some news. After that, the migration towards streaming is enormous. So we think through the tools we're able to provide both residential subscribers and in these other markets, the future looks really good for us. The other area that we're focused on innovation is in our communities. And I said earlier that we're led by our employees, which is a little bit different. A lot of companies are trying to have a company brand and that they project out in the communities. And our view is it's really about our employees and what they value in those communities, and the company gets behind the employees. And that impact has caused, I think you saw something a minute ago that said about 2/3 of our employees or 3/4 of our employees are involved and engaged in community service in some way with ViaSat behind them. And the impact we're having, I think, is pretty broad. If you go to our Carlsbad campus, you'll see a lot of support for local artists. For instance, Aaron Chang's work is everywhere in our buildings. And so if you go to our offices in Atlanta, it's going to look like Atlanta. And I know there's a lot of that stuff here at Sony. So if you go to Atlanta, you're probably not going to have sushi, but you're probably going to have barbecue. In Carlsbad, it's different. In Lausanne, Switzerland, it's going to take on that flavor, but still feel and look like ViaSat. We see some really big changes coming up in terms of how you manage innovation in your company. And I'd say the single biggest change that we're working with right now is, historically, in the way I grew up, it was really about individual performance and individual evaluation. That's migrating very quickly to team performance and team innovation. And we know certainly the newer group of students that we're hiring, we try to focus heavily on college hires and getting new minds into the company is a top priority. And they want to work in teams, and they want to work with people, and they want to build relationships. And how you evaluate them is changing, and it's different. And Google had done a study on the key indicators of all the successful teams at Google. What were the characteristics that they were common in successful team versus non-successful, not necessarily the most successful teams? And by far, number one, nothing even close. It was about relationships. It's about the people they were working with. And did they have trust? Did they have an open environment to communicate ideas and a supportive network to operate in? Pretty interesting. And so we're seeing that movement from individual, although people will still like to be identified and have goals, but it's a big change in the company and how we think about it. There was how many people know who Clayton Christensen is? I'll ask another question. Only a couple. Great Harvard strategy professor, Rhodes Scholar. He was, I think he passed away either yesterday or the day before, just recently. He wrote a book called How Will You Measure Your Life? And in that book, he identifies some common characteristics of successful people that came out of Harvard versus other people. He saw this trend when he was going back to Harvard again and again over time to their annual meeting and his classmates. And, at first everybody's doing great, and then a few people start falling off, and you got some people going to prison, and you have other things occurring. But in the long run, the one characteristic he found of people that were both successful in business and successful in their personal lives was relationships. It was like number one. So this thing that the new people are craving, and this long-term measurement, what Clayton Christensen writes about, are the same, and I find that pretty interesting. There's another Harvard professor that has done a long-term study, over 70 years, of people and how do you measure success of people that had gone to Harvard and graduated. Same thing, successful in a personal life, successful in business. And his came down to one word that was the highest common denominator of all those people that were, and it was love. And it just kind of blows me away that I think, you can say the two go together. It's a pretty strong bond, but the young people, what they're looking for, and how do you really over time measure the success of the other people? It's all the same thing. It's about who we get to work with, who do we do business with, who can we depend on, who can we trust. And what we found at ViaSat is those are self-selecting items that over time, if you get to work with great people, and sometimes we hire people that don't fit in quite as well, and they tend to over time self-select out. People don't want to work with them on their teams if they're not as high performing and as trustworthy and reliable as the others. And so it's, we have about, over the last few years, about a 7% employee turnover rate. We have a 3% regrettable employee turnover rate, which is incredibly low in this high-tech marketplace. And it's, it's kind of hard to stay up with all the changes, but the thing that we're hyper-focused on is making sure people get to work in good teams, that we can measure team performance, and that we have to communicate with them as things change. We've had to make major changes over the last few years in just introduction of AI teams and data analytics teams and data analysts and things that we hadn't valued as much 10 years ago, but are becoming really, really important. New software development tools and that. And as we bring those changes through, it really is about how does our group go through that together. So I will focus with the other trend that we're seeing that I'm focused on at our company. And it's really the focus on customers and customer outcomes that, so I think if we focus on employees, employee retention, and recruiting of high quality employees, we can reduce the costs associated with that turnover. And we focus on customer outcomes, not just products. How do our customers feel about that? How do they rate what we're doing? Are we changing their lives? Are we bringing education to them in healthcare, not just, focused on the other elements? That those two things, in general, when you look at great companies, help make them more profitable and longer lasting. So that's it. That's all I've got to say to you guys tonight. Hopefully you get a little feel of who ViaSat is, a company that we think is innovating up in Carlsbad. Very, very broad level of customer base and broad level of technology skills. And thank you guys for letting me come tonight. Thanks.